Hello, it's Phil Crowshaw again from Passions, and in this episode we're going to be talking about Simon Templar, the Saint. Those that know. Enjoy. Hello, and a very warm welcome to yet another edition of Passions. And my guest today has really had me very intrigued when I found out I was going to have the fortune to interview him. And the person I'm interviewing today is Ian Dickerson. And I think the best way to do this interview and to start this interview is just to hand over to Ian and say, Ian, thank you for coming on Passions. Tell us who you are and what your passion is.
Thank you for having me. My name is Ian Dickerson, and I have a passion for the adventures of Simon Templar, which has led me to have a passion for a good story.
Wonderful. And we talk a lot actually on Passions about stories, and we work with clients about stories. So it's a perfect match on so many levels. Now, I have to say, and I'll be honest about this right up front, being perhaps the age I am, Simon Templar was definitely one of my boyhood heroes. The Saint.
Absolutely.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. So tell us about how you got into it. Why Simon Templar? Tell us the story.
Well, without wishing to sound rude or anything, I suspect you and I were the same generation. And I was very much a child of the 70s. So
yes,
when I was 8 or 9, I discovered a TV show called Return of the Saint, starring Ian Ogilvy. And you know, being 8 or 9 years old, what was not to like in it? There were fast cars, there were lovely women, there was a hero who went around bopping ungodly on the head. It was great fun. And it finished one weekend. I think, seemed to recall it aired Sunday evenings or something, 7:30 p.m. because I very much associated with Bath night, and that was definitely Sunday before school on Monday. But I discovered that my elder brother had a couple of books which had the word Saint in the title. So they kind of got borrowed. Thank you, Andy. And I read them and I was hooked. And in the back of these books, there was a list of more books featuring the Saint. So I spent many years and pretty much all my pocket money hounding secondhand bookshops trying to find every single adventure of the Saint that I could. And I loved them.
All I can say is, and this is another unfortunate admission, is that I got involved in him and I got hooked on him back in the day of Roger Moore.
Well, yeah, I can't say too much about that, can I? But it was funny for me that in everything I've done with the Saint, for the Saint, take your pick. For me, people go, "Oh, who's your favourite Saint?" I say, "Who's your favourite Bond?" I am, I'll man up. I'm a child of the 70s. So for me, Ian Ogilvy was the TV Saint. The best Saint is the one in my head. But that's because I love the stories and I'm much more of a literary person. But for me, Roger was always Bond. I never actually saw Roger as the Saint until the late 80s when I started helping out ITC Home Video, who were then releasing the episodes on video cassette.
That's fascinating because I remember the black and white versions, and I'm not as old as I might seem, albeit I'm thinking now maybe I am. But it's interesting you should say that, because for me it was probably the fact that when I got to know the Saint as Roger Moore, so when Roger Moore started to do James Bond, I had to do the conversion the other way and had to convert my appreciation of Roger Moore in the Bond movies and stories versus my seeing him as the Saint back in the what must have been, I guess, the 60s, I guess. So you say about stories. So obviously, what is it about the Saint stories that are particularly that next level up, if you like, in terms of the story?
I think what attracted me to them was yes, it was the nature of them. I don't know if you've ever read a Saint book, but Leslie took the Saint through, he wasn't just a spy like Bond is. He was a modern day adventurer. So he was sometimes a thief, sometimes he was on a caper, he was on a heist, sometimes he'd break into somewhere. Sometimes he was involved in war games, that sort of thing as well. I love the variety of those stories. And Leslie, when he wrote the Saint books, never wrote down to his audience. He wrote very literate, very clever adventures. And he himself would admit at times that, his plotting wasn't sometimes the best. Excuse me. But those stories and the way he told those stories just had me hooked. I clearly it was, I was in the right time in the right place, and it just grabbed me completely. So
obviously you started off by reading the books, so you was in your imagination, and then they came out on TV at a later date. Is that my right understanding?
Well, no, I mean, I think, I'd certainly seen a few episodes of Ian as the Saint before I discovered the books. But Ian Saint is generally quite a bit different from the one in the books, because it was very much a latter-day saint, and the books started in 1928, and I think the first couple of books I discovered were set in the 30s and 40s, so it was very much a different world then. But it was just the way those stories were told just had me hooked, and there was a lovely, lovely sense of humour running throughout them.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, it was back in the days when you could have pretty women. It was allowed, shall we say, as you intimated.
Yeah, I'm not sure you can get away with that nowadays, but yeah, absolutely.
Well, you can't. I acknowledge it, and it's just funny because we lived there during those times. You can't apologise for the days you lived in. You lived in, and there was a cultural norm, and that's just the way it was. Just like Carry On films, in a way, I suppose.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things I really love about the Saint stories is the fact that he fights for the underdog. He fights for people who need a hand, who need some help. And there was a line used in the latest version of the Saint, which basically just said the world needs a saint. And when you look at how the Saint is nowadays, I love that idea of treading the fine line between fiction and non-fiction. Wouldn't it be great if the world had a saint nowadays?
Yeah, absolutely. And arguably, I think, and this, I would have said this probably before COVID, but since COVID, I'd say even more strongly, is sort of that whole area of imagination and the ability to, frankly, I think the word that springs to mind is escape, in a way, from reality, has become more important than ever. And we saw it on a massive scale more recently with the Harry Potter stories.
Absolutely. And when you look back at history, the Saint books in the 30s particularly were bestsellers around the world. They were bestsellers in America and in the UK. And one of the biggest reasons why was people needed escapism in the 1930s, because, there's a war brewing and then happening, and people just needed to get away. And I think to a degree we've lost a lot of that nowadays in that particular genre. I agree with you. Harry Potter was great escapism, and it grabbed the world, clearly. It didn't grab me. I've never read them, to be honest. But, I like that idea of, I guess the thing for me, I loved sci-fi when I grew up, but I guess I've kind of grown out of it. And I love the idea of escapism that has one foot in reality. I love the Avengers, which was kind of almost real, but really not quite. And I mean the proper Avengers, not these Marvel people.
The real deal.
Exactly. And I, for me, that is it. For me, it's the what if scenario.
And are there any other stories that are up there on anywhere near that kind of level that grip you in a similar kind of way?
I don't know if they grip me like that. I mean, I am quite a voracious reader. I've got boxes of books sitting around the house. And, I've gone through, there are stories. I love thrillers. I love Harlan Coben's material. I love various other modern day authors, but there's none who, for me, grasp the style and the sense of humor. I mean, as we said, it is escapism, and the world we live in at the moment is quite frankly absurd, and I would love to escape of it. But no one quite does it for me. Everyone, for my liking, is a little too based in reality. I'm not sure what that says about me, but there we go.
Yes, but Ian, self-awareness is a wonderful quality, I always think. That's absolutely true. One of the things that interests me actually is that I'm at the heart of it, I guess. The only conclusion I can come to is that I'm a little bit on the lazy side. So I tend to go with and enjoy the TV show or the movie. My dad, however, before he passed away a couple of years ago, was like you, a voracious reader. My wife now reads a lot less, but she talks about how, and my dad used to say the same, that when she read Harry Potter, it was amazingly more, significantly better for her than when she watched the movies. Is that the same for you? Do you go into a much deeper place when you're able to read it?
Absolutely, yeah. It is a whole different universe, and for me, a lot of the attraction now, I must admit, with particularly the early Saint stories, is that it takes me into the past, and I find myself, I guess I'm of an age where I won't say I hanker for the past, but it was definitely a simpler, easier, less challenging time, particularly in the given the recent situation in the last year or so with the pandemic. And it just takes me away from all that into a different world.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true. Do you reread the show? Do you reread the books then? Or is it once you've read it once or twice, then that's the job done? Or do you kind of reread a few years later?
I have lost count of the number of times I've read the Saint books. Honestly, I have. I mean, it's gotten to the stage, and I was lucky enough to be able to tell Leslie this before he died, and I've told his widow this subsequently, that, sometimes for all of us, life is challenging. When I need cheering up, when I need to find something that's a bit more life-affirming and fun, I just go read a Saint story. There have been other times. A few years ago, I was asked to oversee the publication of reprints of the Saint books in both the US and the UK. So obviously I had to, it was a good excuse to go and read the Saint books again from start to finish. And there's a lot of them. So yeah, as I say, I've lost track of how many times I've read these books.
So tell us a little bit about Leslie then, Leslie, the author. Tell us a bit about him, what you know about him, what you discovered about him, and obviously how you managed to eventually meet him.
It's probably better if I kick off with my story still. I mean, basically, I spent, I'm 10 years old, my formative years I've spent finding Saint books. And at one stage, there's an advert in the back of one of them for the Saint Club, which was a fan club that Leslie had set up for fans of the Saint back in the 1930s, I think it was. And much to my parents' chagrin, because the book had been printed in 1940 something, I wrote off in the hope that I might be able to join. They said, well, that book is about 50 years old. I wouldn't hold your breath. But I got a response, and I joined the Saint Club. And for many years, I was a happy member, buying merchandise and getting an annual letter from Leslie Charteris himself. And then in the late 1980s, when oddly enough, the Simon Dutton TV show was announced, I wrote to the Saint Club and said, look, you've got a great opportunity to publicise yourself, to shout about yourself, to shout about the Saint. And I got no response until a couple of weeks later when Leslie Charteris rang me up. And once I'd picked my jaw up off the floor, we had a good chat. And he invited me to lunch at the Four Seasons in Mayfair. Now, wow. I was 18 years old at the time. And I will happily hold my hand up and say I was so naive, it was embarrassing. The Four Seasons in Mayfair, you had to wear a jacket and tie just to have lunch. Did I have a jacket and tie? No, I did not have a jacket and tie. But we had a good lunch, we had a good chat, and that evolved into a friendship with both him and his wife, Audrey, who was a former Hollywood actress by the name of Audrey Long. And for whatever reason, I have no idea why, and I've spent many years trying to analyse why, we hit it off, and we ended up with sort of having weekly phone calls, monthly lunches, to talk through all sorts of things. I helped him write a book, a true crime book that he had half written back in the 1940s, but couldn't quite complete. He told me no end of dirty jokes. And there was me, this admittedly naive 18-year-old, sitting in this retired author study, hearing him tell me some very naughty jokes, thinking, what on earth is happening here? And as I say, for many years we bumbled along. He was kind enough to open his address book to me, so I got to meet the likes of Robert S. Baker, who produced Roger's TV show, Ian's TV show, and has been associated with the Saint ever since. Through Bob, I got to meet various other people, including Roger, including Ian, and people like that. And it happened like that, really. In the late 1980s, I think it was. God, I feel old now. I was asked to help with the home video releases of ITC Home Video, who were looking to exploit the Saint on video, and subsequently on DVD a few years later. I have made documentaries on the making of the Saint and Return of the Saint, which were great fun because we got Ian Ogilvy to narrate the documentary on Roger's show and Roger to narrate the documentary on Ian's show. As I said, I've overseen the reprints in both the US and UK of 36 or 49 books, depending on which country you're in. I was a co-producer on the 2017 TV movie of The Saint, which is now on Netflix. And I've written a number of books about various aspects of the Saint's career.
So they say it's not always a good idea to meet your heroes, but I'm assuming that wasn't the case here.
Not at all. I was so lucky to meet all of them, really. I got to sit next to Roger Moore in a recording studio whilst he recorded the script I'd written. It is every fan's dream of heaven almost, I think.
Absolutely amazing. There's a few things that jump out at me. One of them that jumps out at me, as you know, passions, apart from exploring people's passions and where they come from, is also about, I suppose, the ideal scenario of maybe making a business and or a career out of it. You've obviously managed to make a career out of it.
I'm trying. I'm definitely trying. It's not the best career. I have to have a day job because mortgage companies don't look favourably on freelance writers. It is what it is. But a lot of what I've done in terms of the books and indeed the career is because at heart, all I really want to see is more Saint adventures, more good Saint adventures. And if I'm involved in it, so much the better. I'm really lucky. If I'm not, I don't care. I'll sit at home and watch them or read them and just be happy as Larry.
What I find fascinating is that the fact that you've managed to make some finance out of it. And when I say careers, well, careers are, it's like we live in an age now where I talk a lot about with my consultancy clients about side hustles. So because of the internet nowadays, it's very, very possible for virtually anybody to make a sideline amount of money or financial gain on the side, even if it's just selling, I don't know, cups on eBay. It's very possible now to do that.
Like that one?
Oh, yeah. Well, listen, yeah, it had to be, didn't it? It had to be. It had to be. So, yeah, it's not always about the careers as in a lawyer or something like that, but it's the fact you've been able to, and I hate this word, but it's almost like you've been able to monetize it to a point, even though it's obviously a passion, just a passion. So what, if you had to analyze your passion for this, how does it differ from an interest?
I think I've said in the past, I'm certainly not a typical fan. For me, I went through, I certainly was the typical fan of the Saint. I went through collecting the books, the DVDs, anything remotely Saint related I would grab as much as I could have. And I would, I could have sit there quite happily watching the Saint all day long. But I'm kind of driven now by, I guess I've moved on from just being a fan. And don't get me wrong, I still love watching Saint movies. I was watching one yesterday while I was doing some sorting out, and it was one of the old black and white ones, and it was lovely, and there were scenes in it I couldn't told you have existed before. and to the point where I wondered whether I was watching a different version of the one I'd seen before. But I don't want to say it's become a business for me, because it hasn't. But I'm driven more by just, I like the type of hero the Saint is. I like the idea that it can be plug and played into every genre. And I would very much like to see a hero like that in the 21st century. And again, at the risk of repeating myself, if I can, in some way, shape, or form, be involved in it, then I'm very lucky.
Does it ever concern you that over time that somehow all this might be lost? Obviously I'm thinking of, where I'm coming from, I'm sure, but I'm thinking about the massive explosion now of IMAX theatre, and it's all about billion different pixels flying around and CGI and everything. Do you ever worry that it'll be lost somehow over the next few years?
Yeah, very much so. And again, I think that's an element of what drives me. The Saint is a particular sort of hero. I mean, certainly historically, the Saint was compared largely to James Bond, but James Bond has gotten very, very serious, very gritty, and very much gone down one avenue, which leaves, to my mind, a large appeal for a hero such as the Saint, who's got a sense of humour, who has a certain sense of style and wit that, quite frankly, Bond doesn't seem to have at the moment. It's not to say Bond can't and won't be reinvented. I'm sure it will be when Daniel Craig leaves. But it also concerns me, the Saint has been in books, it's been in film, it's been in TV, and at the moment it's probably one of the lowest profile franchises going. And it pains me that style of storytelling, that style of hero may well get overlooked. And if I can do something to stop it, great.
Yeah, it is. It's absolutely right. And, I can just, I've got a son who's now 11, and it just almost seems as if it's not in 3D multicolor whish bang wallop. They kind of just they're just not absorbed into it. I'm not even sure, and people will probably challenge me on this, which is absolutely fair enough. But I even question just how much are kids reading at all now.
It's funny you say that, because I've had various conversations with Leslie's family about for want of a better phrase, restarting the books, because the Saint started in books. To my mind, the Saint books should be carrying on. But their point, which is perfectly valid, unfortunately, is that publishers are going to look for mass appeal, and Saint doesn't have mass appeal at the moment. And books on their own will not resurrect mass appeal for the Saint, because certainly, as you point out quite rightly there, younger people are not reading books, anything like en masse that our generation perhaps is. And it's an interesting challenge, because these are certain types of story, and there is a medium to tell them. I'm sure there is. There's a medium to find success. Oh, excuse me. I just don't quite know what it is or where it is at the moment. There is a film deal. There is a Saint film in development at Paramount. And as you may have seen in your research for this, Dexter Fletcher is signed on to direct it. So,
yeah.
It's very serious, very real. And I know they're looking at it as a kind of partner franchise for Mission Impossible, which makes a lot of sense, not just with the 60s TV show links. And again, part of that split, going a bit veering slightly off your question, I've always had a theory that, there is room for the Saint in the 21st century, not just, my line about the world needing a Saint, but there's room for a Saint hero in the 21st century, because you go back to the original Saint stories, what he was doing was disrupting the police activities. He was having a lot of fun there. I would love to explore those early stories and bring that early character of the Saint into the 21st century. But similarly, you go and read the early Saint books, and a period Saint show based on those almost writes itself. I don't want to see the Saint stuck in the 30s and 40s. I would love to see him reinvented. And I think both Saints could coexist, but that's just my theory. What do I know? But it's how to get bums on seats either reading or watching those stories, and it is a tough challenge.
Yeah, significantly easier to say, isn't it? It's at the heart of it. It's like anything else. It's capturing the imagination, and it's arguably it's the sort of thing that is keeping a lot of businesses and companies awake at night these days, all the time. Marketers in particular. How do you get the attention engagement of an audience that's bombarded with a gazillion dillion audio, video, pictures, text, social media, and everything else? How do you cut through the noise, as it's often known?
Well, I think you're right, and I think that is almost the core question, and I think that's why a lot of what you're seeing at the moment is a lot of reinvention or continuation of established brands. And the Saint, let's face it, first appeared in 1928. It's been going for years, and right, it's had quite a few years, but it's got fairly good brand recognition. The problem is a lot of that brand recognition is associated with Roger Moore's version of the Saint. And bless him, I loved Roger as the Saint. He was a lovely chap, but you can't really make that international man of mystery work in the 21st century. Not without asking questions of where does he get his money from? How does he do all this? What's his motivation? All this sort of stuff. Because audiences, readers in the 21st century, they want to know a bit more about the backstory, about the character motivation, about why this guy is doing what he can do. And Leslie never spelled it out, purposely never spelled it out, and he got away with it for 80 years.
That's such a great point. I'm thinking about, at the moment we're recording this at the end of April 2021. And obviously, most recently, we've had another series, I think it's series 6, isn't it, of Line of Duty. And it's fascinating when I'm watching it with my wife, it's amazing how many times you say, well, does that make sense? That doesn't make sense because he wouldn't that, or where did she get that from? Or there's almost like just significantly more analysis, I think.
There is. I think, people are naturally curious, and, the internet has many pros and cons, but one thing it has done is give us the world knowledge at our fingertips. So people want to know why, who, where, how, what, and that applies to characters as well as stories and situations. And it's something, quite frankly, in the discussions I've had with producers and other creatives over the years, it's something people have struggled with to explain. The 1997 film had, I think it'd be polite to say, it was very loosely based on Leslie's novels, and had, a child in an orphanage reading one of Leslie's novels and inspiring him, which is all well and good. I've got no problem with that. But it wasn't really the Saint. But then, there was this thing, the guy is a modern day Robin Hood, but why is he a modern day Robin Hood? There was some discussions I've had we kind of hinted at it in the 2017 film of, well, his parents were killed, and, he goes off investigating the death of his parents. No, that's Batman. He's not a tortured hero. This is the Saint. He's having fun doing what he's doing.
Would you say you're a purist?
No, not at all. You see, to my mind, I hark back to a conversation I had in the development of this Netflix thing, where people were going, "Oh, you're going to have the halo appear over his head. You've got to have the halo appear over his head." And I kind of go, well, yeah, if we could do it in a way that isn't cheesy, but it's cheesy. How can you have the guy? I might have had a bit of fun and have him stand in front of a streetlight and have a halo appear around him or something like that, but you can't have a guy on TV nowadays look up and go, "Oh, look at my halo."
I think the key word there is nowadays, because back in the day, that was definitely a key part of it, wasn't it? And it just, when you talk about brand, and obviously in business, people talk about brand all the time. It's the only game in town a lot of the time these days. And you talk about brand, but I can remember, and I've not seen it for a long time, but I can remember him looking up at the halo, and I can also remember the tune, which was something like da 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 da.
Perfect. Yeah, but you see, the other thing is, I was watching the new Magnum the other day, Now, I don't know if you've seen that, but they've got the old title sequence, the original title music. They've got a guy who looks nothing like Tom Selleck, but he does the job fine. I'm not having a pop at him. And they've got him doing voiceovers. So the voiceovers work, but it doesn't break the fourth wall. Roger, it was such fun when the Saint broke the fourth wall, said, come on in, audience, come and have some fun with me. They don't do that anymore. You've got to have a sort of bit of tongue-in-cheek humour.
Yeah, no, I totally understand where you're coming from. And I understand that, you mentioned about the Saint Club. Isn't there some charity work now that the Saint Club's involved in? Have I got that right?
There is to a degree. I will hold my hand up and say that the Saint Club is somewhat quiet at the moment, simply because it's a one-man show, and that's me. And there aren't many in the way of new Saint adventures to talk about. So it's kind of keeping a low profile, shall we say. But basically, the Saint Club's reason, basically, ever since it's existed, it's donated all its profits to charitable causes. And for many years pre-NHS, that meant a hospital ward that was maintained in London. Post-NHS, that we took the profits and donated them to a youth centre in the East End of London. Since then, we have basically donated profits to any charity nominated by Leslie's family.
Fantastic. So obviously there was, and that's what happens, I think, with most charity efforts, whatever that means. It does kind of wax and wane a little bit over time, doesn't it? Depending on what's going on. And let's be fair, we've all been distracted quite somewhat in the last 15 months on a level that, to be honest, no story could have ever captured, actually.
No, indeed. And, I happily hold my hand up and say at the moment, my focus is much more on writing books than doing the Saint Club stuff. However, excuse me, I am in the process of getting back into it, so we'll see where it goes.
Fabulous. Well, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and any value, anything that can be done to help people in these tough times, I think is definitely worth an applause. So thanks very much for joining me today, and covered quite a bit there, and it really has taken me back on a nostalgic trip, I have to say, to be fair. He was a hero of mine, definitely was a hero of mine back in the day, and of course, back in those early days, back in the 60s and, as you say, the 70s, I suppose the truth was there was very little else to do than read good books and use your imagination.
Indeed. Yeah, no, absolutely.
It was...
Look where that's got us.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So thanks for joining me today, and some wonderful thoughts there. I'm sure that anybody that's interested in reading and stories will get some value from that. And in particular, anybody that's interested in the Saint or wants to go on a trip down memory lane like me and think again about Simon Templar and the Saint and all the stories, will get a lot of value out of that. So thanks today. And probably doesn't need saying, but your passion for this subject is very clear to see. And I just love that whole kind of passions conversation, where it's not about, because we're doing quite a few different people, including celebrities and all the rest of it, but it's just as important to look at and explore and discuss what you might call grassroots football. It's almost like grassroots passions. It's just wonderful, because it's what makes people tick, and it's what it's what makes the world go round arguably as well. So thanks very much for joining me today. Okay. I really, really appreciate your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Ian.